my name is Greg Wendt. I'm an executive director here at PathLock. Just a little bit about me. I started back with ERP systems, specifically PeopleSoft, back in the late '97 on version 5. I've been in and around working on the customer side for many, many years, oil and gas, retail, higher ed. Before coming to join the PathLock team, I've been here about 9.5 years. On this side of it. So for many years, I was sitting doing the same jobs that everybody else is doing out there, upgrading, implementing, making sure it's patched, fixed as an enterprise architect. So one of the things that I've spent a lot of time on my career with is really around provisioning HR campus solutions, to where it's managing accounts, it's managing access. Rolled out self-service access, way back in the day with the Java applets to about 45,000 employees across the United States. That was way back in the day. So I understand a lot of what we're going to be talking about with risks, today. So a lot of the risks have really changed over the recent years as to how the bad guys or the bad actors are going to be attacking your organizations and what they're looking for. So that's just a little bit about me. So let's go ahead and introduce quickly PathLock, and then we'll get jumped into really the content at hand today. So PathLock really provides a 360-degree view of the risk across your applications. You're going to see that today. So we work with some of the largest enterprises to help manage risks and compliance across their ERP systems, whether that's financial, supply chain management, CRM systems. We give you a single pane of glass, really, to allow you to understand the risks in your organizations, who's got the risks, what you can do to mitigate some of those risks. And we can also help with automating the user access reviews, provisioning and deprovisioning. I also like to talk about compliant provisioning, and we'll go into that a little bit today, because compliant provisioning is really specifically an issue around controlling your risks. So, and then also you want to be able to monitor activities, what people are doing. And really, a lot of the controls that you put into place, if you cannot prove that you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing, whether that's for SOX, or other regulations, then are you actually meeting your requirements is really ultimately the problem there. So we help prove that you're meeting the compliance and the standards that are put in place by what you're doing with your application. So we are a market leader in application governance, risk, and compliance. We really focus on application access governance, the continuous controls monitoring, and the cybersecurity access controls. We're trusted by over 1,300 plus customers globally for compliance confidence. So some of the enterprises today are really seeing a lot of the controls are still tested manually, despite having 7+ tools and service providers on average. Reported material weaknesses are growing. That's not something that seems to be getting better inside of the market. You're looking at 49% reported material weaknesses in 22. And then also the audit costs continue to grow year over year. It's just like everything else, the way it seems right now, and everything is getting more expensive to do. So it's constantly above budget. And it's also, what is it requiring you to do internally? I've talked to several potential customers and customers alike that really the audits are pushing them to do a lot of things internally that they probably really wouldn't have forced to the forefront if they were looking at what was important for the organization as a whole. And a 5 times ROI. PathLock customers are automating controls, testing, and reducing costs and risk up to 80%, which you'll see some of that today through the session that we're working with. So let's go ahead and jump into the session. Security considerations of joiners, movers, and leavers. Why is this important? It's probably one of the largest sticking areas with many organizations out there. 82% of the breaches involve the human element. That comes from the Verizon 2022 data breach investigations report. And it really boils down to the fact that things that are performed manually cause issues and challenges. Whether it's because of the way they're being attacked. If we go back to COVID, many people moved home. They haven't necessarily come back into the office. Offices, the dynamics are very different than what they were before. You're maybe not on a own corporate machine, or even a device that they have that much control over, with the whole bring your own device to work type of scenario. The phishing attempts are extremely sophisticated and very targeted, where before, I've dealt with them for dozens of years, dealing with the different organizations that I worked with, and it used to always be this big wide swath. We're just going to target everybody we possibly can when they're onboarding in. And if you think about many organizations, there's always a hiring event. If you're thinking retail, it's going to be around the Christmas crush before that happens, because you have to get them to train. Talking about higher ed, it's going to be something around onboarding for the new semester. So you've got an event where a lot of people are going to be coming into your organization, and they're easy to target. Another time might be around bonuses, or job appraisals, or W-2s with taxes and things like that. So you've got an event that really draws people to your organization that they can target a lot of phishing around and very specifically at. So it's one of the issues of getting people, when they're busy, they just want to get something done, so they often click on it, then all of a sudden their credentials are gone. So the joiners are really unfamiliar with the processes of how to onboard with your organization. So it really, if you can streamline that event for them and minimize the risk through multiple different things that we'll talk about today, it'll really help move forward as an organization. The movers, think about the movers. I like to treat them a little bit differently because they're the ones that are shifting jobs, making changes in the organizations. They're the ones that possibly end up with additional security that's left over. And how do you handle that? What are you going to do with it? Well, I changed jobs and I need to have that access for another 2 weeks. Then it becomes a month, then it becomes 6 months because they never backfilled the position. And then all of a sudden you're doing both of those positions. And because of that, you've got a highly increased security risk because of the access that you have on both sides of that. So a lot of different scenarios inside of the organization can create the challenges with movers. And automation can help around that. And then leavers specifically is a really big challenge for many organizations. There's a lot of issues with what are the policies, what are the controls, what should they have access to, what should they not have access to. A lot of it's going to depend upon what you're doing from an HCM specific perspective on maybe financials of W-2s or tax related. Do you still have to have access to them, or can you cut them off from your organization completely? I think the governor of Kansas, if I remember here, was just recently in the news because of the leavers. They're mandating that now it has to be within 24 hours they're taken out of the systems. So leavers are important. I've heard of lots of different breaches from admins who were left in the system who still had access even though they left the organization because they didn't change a super user style password that they all had access to. So multiple leavers can cause lots of challenges with whether that's the leaking of sensitive data or access to very high privileged things, just because of the change control that needs to take place depending upon what that particular person's role was inside of the organization. When we think about really the status quo with PeopleSoft Access Management, a lot of organizations still do things the same way. We talk about this with many organizations every day. There's still a lot of manual communication and processes involved, whether that's spreadsheets, whether that's requests, whether it's the emails that are going through, how many different approvals have to take place. So there's a multitude of stakeholders. There's a lot of people who are involved in the migration through all of these, and it's a tedious review when it comes down to the audit on the back end. One, because there are so many different people involved and the process is so not consistent. If you're going through and exchanging emails and then you've got spreadsheets and all of that type of stuff, it becomes very challenging to understand, all right, why was this change generated? What was it? Was it done on time? Was it done efficiently? Was it done consistently? Why was it done differently than one of the other requests that was done before that? So it leads to many different challenges and issues inside of the organization, whether it's slow onboarding, whether it's unproductive users. You can actually tie the two of those together. I've seen the onboarding process, in some organizations could take as long as 6 to 8 weeks. So now you're talking about somebody who's actually sitting there for 6 to 8 weeks, really being unproductive because they can't do what they were hired to do. That's not helping the organization as a whole. And then there's also human error. I mean, I hate to say it, but people do make mistakes. Typically, it's not done intentionally, but the amount of work that many of the security administrators have, or the people who are tasked with this particular job of setting up all of the different the security side, it really does become a challenge to just get everything done. So, and you can really misalign a lot of the resources. When you're talking about onboarding large sums of users or large amounts of users in a short period of time, that's where automation can really come in to help the process. And help those resources that you do have. Some of the common access management challenges inside of the systems is manual and time consuming user onboarding and offboarding. We've talked about that multiple different ways already. It really is a challenge. I think, and I'll go into some of the theoretical side of it and some of the things that I think organizations should really kind of change and shift to believe in with the onboarding and offboarding. And so I'm gonna kind of put an asterisk with that one because I want to go into far more detail on another slide on that particular challenge. And and then talking about the integration between all of your applications. When you look at an enterprise whole, you're bringing in applications that might be best of breed. They're point solutions. They're very targeted for working inside of the system, doing one particular, delivery. So you're going to be integrating those with all sorts of your ERP systems or other applications as a whole. So you want to make sure everything communicates in an efficient manner to where when somebody authenticates, they can move in and out of all of the different applications they have access to. So when you're talking about single sign-on and having that SAML integration, it's really important. But because often that's where you're going to tie into an MFA solution as well. There's pros and cons to how you can do that and why you might want to do it. One of the challenges with MFA with PeopleSoft is you still have so many users that are high privileged users, really, or administrative users that are connecting in a two-tier user ID and password. And when you have a mandate that says they need to perform MFA, if you're only doing it at an SSO event, how are you going to secure that other two-tier user account to get into the system? Because that's something you have to think about, because that's really the highest privileged access into the system, and they're not going through a multi-factor authentication at that particular point. So it opens up another back door that you have to worry about at that particular point. Many people are involved in the access process, the requesters, the users, the reviewers, the approvers, a lot of touch points. How do we do that from the perspective of really making sure that the requester is not also the approver, which happens in some of these organizations. Are people, as a manager requesting the access for the person, and then that goes to an approver that would then get approved. So that make sure that you have the correct workflow to be able to follow through with the fact of the request was made, the request gets approved, and then the access gets granted. And those are done by different people. And that's some of the areas where organizations can get dinged on from an audit flow of just not having the correct separation there. And then also the rubber stamping of the access approval by managers, whether that yearly certification, happens or doesn't happen. There are some groups that I know really don't do UARs like they're supposed to, user access reviews or access certifications, whichever you want to call them in your particular organization. You'll probably hear me use that term kind of interchangeably during the conversation here today. So, it's really about, does the person who's approving the access for that particular user understand what authorizations they have, and should that user have those authorizations? That's ultimately what it boils down to. And you get a lot of situations where people don't want to have to do that because it's coming in, via email. It's an Excel file, or it's very tedious to do. Nobody likes to do that process, and there's just, as I said, a lot of them just don't. And Oracle makes it difficult because there's no centralized platform to manage access and roles across multiple applications. It's the same with whether you're talking about dev, test stage, QA, production, and then looking at financials and HCM and all of those different verticals all put together. There's enough different security within the own dev stack that it causes an issue, especially when you're talking about the fact that that's probably a full copy of production and development. So when we talk about risks and access to data, we need to make sure that the development environment with a full copy of production has almost as many controls or better logging and things like that put into place to minimize that risk. You'd be surprised how many organizations I talk to where that's where the data was accessed, and it becomes very difficult to track who accessed it at that particular point, because it's everybody who has access to dev is a PeopleSoft PeopleSoft developer and doesn't have security because it just allows them to access everything. So that's when we're talking about that risk. It's a complete top-down picture of understanding all of the different risks that are occurring within your PeopleSoft system, and managing those risks is crucial. It becomes very challenging because of multiple different pressure points. Some of those pressure points are on the untimely security audits. You're going to have to deal with them. I've dealt with them, for 20 plus years, and it's just something that you're going to get hit with. Talking to some organizations here recently, because of those audits, it's really changing how they're having to do their day-to-day business. Let's talk about it from an access certification perspective. They've gone from having to do high privileged users every 6 months to quarterly to now to monthly because they weren't meeting the goals of the external audit. That's how it affected them as an organization. How does that increase their costs? Drastically, because now you're tying up all of those internal resources by, having them do something that they weren't doing very well before. So rather than one, certification a year or 2 certifications a year, you're doing 12. That's a significant difference because of the audit. So it changes your internal controls and checks that you're having to put into place. Sometimes when you're dealing with a PeopleSoft system specifically, you can have very complex internal controls because of the way the application itself works and the way your organization is structured as a whole, with how you have data owners and managers and who really needs to approve on this or who needs to review that particular access, and do the auditors really understand where all of the data is being accessed and have the insight into those, which really blends into the inefficient SOD conflicts in the monitoring process. Many times it becomes an issue of just understanding who's looking at what data. Often not. If you really want to understand the data that's being changed, you're going to have to build audit tables around each one of those particular, situations that you're worried about, to be able to understand who's changed that data and what data did they change inside of the application. Going back to that manual user provisioning and deprovisioning, very large risk, very large challenge. I've seen organizations with IDs that, tens of thousands of IDs that are still in the system. Sure, maybe they're locked out and stuff like that, but what happens in the situation of an update or, some scenario like that where all of a sudden users get turned back on. I've seen things like that happen. That's why I bring that up. But we'll go into really that risk of the user provisioning and deprovisioning in depth. So I'm not going to go into too much on that. Inaccurate and time-consuming audit reports. It really boils down to, it becomes, if you've got the right things in play, the right logging, the right controls, it can definitely minimize the amount of time you're going to spend on those audit reports. And it's going to minimize the amount of effects those audit reports have on your organization as a whole. Kind of going back to the fact of, having to do those access certifications 12 times instead of 2. Obviously you're not doing the right things at that particular point, but so it's going to take up an increasingly amount of time inside of your organization. And then also increasing regulatory compliance mandates. This one I probably can't stress enough. There's no telling what's going to happen with data protection, the privacy laws that are put into play. Each and every state's got something different. A lot of countries are doing something different. And it's really, as an organization, we have to be ready for what's coming in the future, and we have to build a model of protection up front. We need to be doing the right things in the beginning, not at the end, because if we're waiting till the end, it's going to be too late, and then all of a sudden it's going to cost us as an organization. So all of these things really help us assess and mitigate the PeopleSoft risks. And that's what we're ultimately trying to do, is lower the risk footprint within our organization. And there's multiple different ways that we can do that. One of the main and quick ways that we can do that is through adopting automation. And there's advantages for automation. One, it allows you to do more with less. I don't know any of the teams out there that have so many people that they don't know what to do with them all. So obviously your teams are required to do more with less on a daily basis. So automation is really key. It can help that. And automation is powering the analytics and the algorithms, to streamline the governance risk, the GRC compliance strategies. So when we look at that, one of the keys is to start with automated provisioning. you know, automated provisioning is important, and I like to try to call this a little bit more as compliant provisioning as well as automated. And the reason I stress that is because I've seen a lot of organizations who really did just fire off and kind of create, okay, we've got an account. Well, how are you doing that? And how are you interacting with your system? How do you know that you're not creating additional risks by what you automated for this particular user? So that's where you have to understand holistically what this user is going to get. How are they going, what are they going to get for any sort of add-on style security? And then how are they going to be taken care of if they leave the organization? So that's where they go through that joiner, mover, leaver process. And there's some definite advantages around that as to why we want to do that. Personally, I believe it should be a least privileged access control around the joiner and the leaver to help tie those in a way that makes sense, to where you can control that at a level to where you know what that user is going to have access to in the beginning. Then you go through the authorizations and the request to give them additional authorizations to do their job because they're an employee first. And then if they ever leave, they go back to that employee role that is only least privileged and they have access to tax, for example. So that's one of the reasons why I call it compliant provisioning and being able to put in those controls. But it's also about recommendation engines. What happens if you make this change? Are you going to increase your risk if you give this person that particular role or access? So that's important as well. And then automated risk analysis. Where are they at now? What are they currently sitting at? This person has all of these authorizations, not just within the PeopleSoft system, but within other systems as well. Workday, or Oracle Cloud, whatever other system you want to work with there, we want to make sure that everything holistically is protected at that particular point. And then cleanup analytics, it's a way of, you want to get clean, stay clean, and prove that you're clean at the end. So all of these things work hand in hand through the automation. And when we take that a step further, Pathologic identity governance is really about a life cycle. So what you're going to see over here on the right-hand side is really moving and shifting through. If we think about it as like an individual employee and then as an organizational level as a whole, it's moving that user through the life cycle to protect them and to protect you as an organization. So we're going to start with smart role design. Why is that important? Because we're going to create and maintain the access rules at that role level that's really going to be very specific for the access and the authorizations that they need. As I said earlier, we like to talk about least privileged access. Why? Because that minimizes your risks. So when we have roles that are designed with least privileged, each one, controls just what that user needs access to be able to do that function. So as you layer those in, obviously they're going to have more and more access through those different roles, but it's very specific to keep them targeted. It's also about understanding their role in the organization. First off, I go back to what I was just talking about. They're an employee first. Regardless of what role they're hired to do in your organization, they're an employee. And as an employee, there's certain job functions that they need to be able to do: payroll, benefits, retirement, all of those types of things. So regardless of what, role they play in your organization, as an employee, they need access to those things. So that's really their least privileged access. That's the compliant provisioning side. So as we deploy those, RBAC rules, role-based access controls, and automating the user lifecycle management through that provisioning, I can grant them that role very quickly. I can give them that access of that least privileged employee role. Why? Because it's consistent for everybody. Everybody's going to be treated the same, really, whether they're an employee or whether a student, for example. I can set them up to where that base role is always exactly the same. So I can onboard them very efficiently at that point. And it's very compliant, it's very targeted. And at that particular point, I can come in with managing the access and ask for that additional access. So now I ask for whatever it's required for them to do their job. The difference between those two that I like to point out is really, when you're talking about managing access or requesting additional access, is often not there's going to be an approval step there. It's a different process. It is the process of, Jimmy now needs the ability to see access to private data, or, to do payroll, or to be an AP clerk. They're going to have access to sensitive information or sensitive processes inside of the organization. And with that, there needs to be an approval process. That's the main difference that I like to talk about really between those two. And it's kind of the differentiator. If there is a request that needs to be approved, that's not something that you really are going to do a lights out provisioning or deprovisioning of, because it becomes a challenge at that point. Who's going to, it's always got that approval step. So that's where we want to manage those requests as we go through there. Then there's the user access reviews or the access certifications. This is something that you're going to do periodically through time, and it's going to allow you to certify that your users have the correct access for what they need at that point in time. It's really boiling down to, should they have the access that they do have, and do they need to continue to have that access? This is where you're going to find some of those users that are caught in that mover of where I, performed this job before, and 6 months ago I moved to a new job, but I still have the authorizations tied to that particular job. So, that's where you're probably going to find those reviews in there, just because of those changes. We then tie that into the SOD audits, the sample testing and violation management. I like to talk about those all holistically, because really all of those have to be involved and built into the system for the role design and the compliant provisioning to work correctly, because you want to have those in effect throughout the life cycle. It's really the basis of how we're looking at the risks of what these users are going to have within your system. And you'll see that when I talk about it from the demo perspective. So when you look at the identity governance, all of these things need to be taken into effect to really manage what this user has from a risk profile inside of your organization. Now, what can we do to have really an always-on security to secure your user access? Because that's really an important part of it as well, is as we access these applications, how can I always be sure that I'm either enforcing the maximum protections that I have to minimize the risk for my organization? First and foremost, it's going to start with strengthening the authentication and access management. When somebody gets into the application, that's your first gateway, basically. So you want to make it as streamlined as possible and as consistent as possible, but you also want to make it secure. So that's where you want to tie into whether you're using single sign-on or a SAML SSO. You want to be able to do that across all of your applications. Why? Because it's going to be consistent and the users are going to notice if something's out of whack. So you're not having to manage unique user IDs and passwords within all of those types of things. Another way that you can do that is you can enable stepped up transaction level authentication. Example of that would be an MFA within a targeted application. What's that going to do? It's going to lower your risk based upon how somebody is accessing the system and the data they have access to. This is about managing that risk holistically through multiple different layers that you see on the right-hand side. Next is going to be protecting sensitive data. This is where I view sensitive data a couple of different ways. Obviously, you need to enable least privilege, but and that's an example of inside the firewall versus outside the firewall versus remote access versus sensitive access. All of those things are layered in least privileged access, but you also have to take into effect as to what data set is being accessed as well. So thinking about the individual's data, I have to protect that. But then if I've got a high privileged user, I have to think about protecting organizational data. And it's just as important in both of the ways to enable least privileged, whether you're a low privileged access user or a high privileged access user. So you really want to expand that data masking across all desired fields to make sure you're having that protection and enabling that least privileged. And keep in mind, I'll put a little asterisk there, do that through your development systems as well. That's going to be key to a lot of your data leakage, because that's where a lot of it's going to happen. And that really helps limit the risk of data exfiltration on unmanaged devices and through other connections to your system. So data masking really helps protect a lot of data from being lost or viewed in areas that you don't really want them to be accessed. There's lots of different reasons for each individual field. And it kind of goes down, a whole data discovery data management, data ownership as to how and why you should really protect that sensitive data. And then you also need to monitor those privileged sessions. When somebody is doing something that's out of bounds or break glass, firefighter, whatever you really want to call it, if they're doing something like that, you need to manage their session and understand what they're working with. And then you also, those high privileged users that have enterprise level data, you need to understand and be able to track what they're doing as well. And then you also have to have that direct visibility into the ERP user activity, whether that's through, very detailed logging with targeted and configurable logs, and then the real-time analytics to understand through incident response who touched what data, who looked at something, because somebody is going to give up their credentials. You are going to go through incident response, whether anything was accessed or not. You still have to be able to prove that. So you need to be able to access that information as quickly as you possibly can to be able to go through that. And it's going to help with simplifying your auditing and monitoring of your security and compliance risks and be able to respond to those auditors. So you can see over on the right-hand side, there's multiple different ways to access that ERP data. You're going to have to layer all of your protections in place. You have to start with your stepped up multi-factor authentication. You can layer in your data masking, click to view, make sure that you're doing your least privilege controls. And on the outer side, to even gain access into the system, make sure that you're performing your authentications in a consistent SSO manner that's protecting your applications across your organization as a whole. So when we look at automating your entire access and governance lifecycle, it really is about strengthening the security and compliance model. We do that through multiple different ways. So you can see, I'll kind of work my way around the circle here. The user onboarding. There's multiple ways that you're going to be able to do that. Through your role design and through the processes itself, you're still going to have your access requests. Why? Because those are going to be the changes. Those are going to be your high privileged users. The account creation and really termination or locking, you could probably do those automatically. You could take care of a large swath of all of that automatically. Through the design of your roles to make sure they're very targeted and very specific to what that user is going to get. And then when your access governance over on the right-hand side, it's about your segregation of duty, compliant provisioning, and your user access reviews. All of that is about certifications and compliance and making sure that you're doing something consistently while reducing your risks and you're not allowing somebody to do something that they shouldn't be able to do, like be able to pay people and update time, for example. And then identity and data security. This is very specific and targeted to inside of the application. So you want to make sure that you're integrating with SSO. You're also doing things like dynamic MFA and data masking, and then threat detection and alerting. So all of these things together, those three main areas of user onboarding, access governance, and identity and data security can really be managed through the automated workflows and secure user access. It's a life cycle that Pathlock can help you control and build. So with that, I'm going to jump into demo here real quick. So I'm going to flip over to one of my other systems. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start with provisioning. So I'm going to go ahead and log into one of my PeopleSoft systems, and I'm going to do something here real quick inside. So what I'm going to do is create a business event. So I've created a workflow around onboarding a student, because students or employees are very similar. They can be treated the same from the fact of, one, I want to control the access that they're going to have. It's going to be defined. I want it to be repeatable, and I want them to be able to move in and out of the system, quickly, really, because there's certain things that they need to be able to do. Benefits, payroll, add, drop a class. You want them to be able to do that as quickly as possible. So inside of Campus Solutions, what I'm going to do is maintain an application, and I'm going to go ahead and put in a user ID here, search for this user, and I'm going to go to the program data. Inside of the program data, I'm going to add a new row here, and I'm going to go ahead and matric this student. It's the same thing as hiring an employee, basically. I'm just creating an event in PeopleSoft like somebody normally would. At this point, once that program is created, inside of PeopleSoft, what it did is it shifted who is the owner of this record. But typically what this does is it means that I now have somebody who is coming to my organization. So I'm going to do this real quick. I'm going to do a new window and just show you from the perspective of recently viewed. Let's go to user profiles, and I'm going to show there is not a user profile defined with this particular user. So I'm going to go in to our PathLock cloud system, and what I'm going to start with is I'm going to run the organizational structure. So what we do is we're going to communicate. I'm going to go ahead and kick this off while we're talking. What we're doing is we're going to communicate out to the PeopleSoft system and synchronize the data. So this is checking to see within PeopleSoft if there's any sort of data change. It could be somebody moving, like leaving the organization, and now we want to remove their authorizations. You know, in this situation, it's somebody coming to the organization. So I want to go ahead and now add in authorizations for that user. So what you can see now is it's synchronizing that data. So it's going out, communicating with the PeopleSoft system and saying, hey, has anything changed? Well, we've got a new person that we need to do something with. So now what's going to happen is it's going to invoke a workflow, and that workflow is going to take certain parameters like certain business roles. These business roles are defined and built in a way, now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and look at the requests. Those business roles are built to where this particular user is going to end up with very unique situation. We're going to go ahead and we can see that we've got a new employee. The employee is ADP, which is that same one that I just actually set over here. So we can go through that workflow and see that it was performed on the campus solution system. One of the things that they were granted was they were granted a certain group of roles, and I'll show you that in just a second. But from the workflow, we can see that it was started, we created the account, we added the authorizations, and we wrapped that up. If I were to go back to the user profile here real quick, I'm going to be able to hit search. I now have that role within PeopleSoft. So just that quickly, we created that role. We set the primary permission list based for this particular, student. We've got the ID tied to the employee ID. We also have the roles. These are those roles that I was talking about. So we're going to know that we can set these up, and every student's going to be the exact same way, or every onboarding of an employee is going to be the exact same way. We're going to set that to a way that it's very consistent, it's repeatable. I don't have to think about it. I don't even have to touch it. When the event occurs within the PeopleSoft system, I can onboard that user. We can do the same thing to create an Active Directory account. We can create an HCM account, campus account, FCM account. We can do all of those different accounts. So it can touch multiple different systems to be able to create that workflow for you with that consistent piece. And this is where I talk about going back to, this is what we've hardened. So if I go back to our system over here, I'm going to open up the business roles, because the business roles are really what we built and defined around. This is what the student gets. So this is the example of all the different roles. Looks very similar to what you just saw on the PeopleSoft side. So this is what we're going to give those users every time, this event occurs. It's also least privileged. It's not giving them anything, access to super user, payroll, any of those other types of functions. Very targeted to least privileged access. It's tested, it's repeatable, it's audited. We know exactly what they have access to, and it's going to be 100% consistent every single time. There's no zero user involvement. The entire system took care of it when that functional person modified the data within the PeopleSoft system. Turnkey, in, out, done. So it allows you to very quickly and consistently create that access. So now the next question comes in, okay, there's the joiner, so now when I want to think about it a little bit differently, I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit. And I think I've got another session open. So one of the things that I want to look at here is I'm going to go to our portal. So our portal is often the way self-service requests are made for requesting additional information inside of a system. As I talked about earlier, the request and the access really needs to be about compliant access. It's very important to understand what a user already has access to versus what the new authorizations would give them. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going in to make a request of additional access for a user. Keep in mind, remember, this is one of those requests where typically there's going to be an approval. So I'm going to make the request and it would go over to somebody. We communicate to multiple different systems. So this could be Workday, it could be PeopleSoft, it could be SAP, multiple different systems. I'm going to grab a financial system here and I'm going to go ahead and grab a user. As I hit next, what we're going to immediately do is we're going to grab from our store what authorizations this user already has. Very clean, very efficient. Now I know what this user can do. So let's say that I want to add in another role for this user. So I'm just going to hit AD and I'm going to give them an administrator role. Yes, very high privileged, probably wouldn't be doing this in real life, but it works well for the example. So I'm going to add that role. What you're going to understand now is let's look at the risks of what adding this new role is going to change for this user. Keep in mind, we want to manage our risks through every additional step that we do for this user. So rather than having to wait until after the fact, I can run a risk analysis up front to understand what is this going to change for this user. If I allow this authorization to go through, is there an increased risk for my organization that I need to be concerned about? Well, right now I can see that. Instantaneously, we're going to have two different risks that are created for this financial user. They're going to be able to open and close accounting periods, which is low, sensitive access, but you'll see the status is new on both of those. It's because of this role, and it's given them access to each of these different risks. So now that would be an increased risk for this user based upon the additional request that was granted to them or would be granted to them. So now at this particular point, I could either choose to, okay, do I approve this? Do I send it back and I reject it and say, hey, we need to look at creating or slicing and dicing these roles up a little bit more finitely so that this user doesn't get the authorizations that cause them to have these types of risks in the organization. Because for us, we're not willing to let that SOD risk stand. We're gonna make sure that they don't get that beforehand. We don't want to have to worry about that risk on the back end. So up front, we understand that risk profile before they even get that access. That's what we talk about compliant provisioning and being able to access that and blend that in holistically throughout this particular process flow. I'm going to also step back a little bit and really talk about a couple of different things as well. What we can do here is we can communicate with multiple different systems, as I was saying earlier, and there's a couple of different reasons why you might want to do that. One, I'm going to look at the employees. And this is one of my demo systems, so we can see our employees. Here's their full name. We've got information because we're syncing from the HCM or whatever the identity of source is. You can also see their risk level over here to the side to define what type of risk they have. So what we're doing, if I look at Abigail here real quick, is drilling into the detail of what she has access to. We're going to get information about the particular user, what their hire date is, who their manager is, who they report to. Why is that important? That's important from a user access review or access certification. Who are we going to direct that to? We can also see what users they have. So we can see Abigail as a user account in Ariba, SAP, JD Edwards, PeopleSoft Financials, and Oracle EBS. All of those different systems she has access to, all the different activities that she can have access to, and then also the roles. So we can see the individual roles that this user has in all of those target systems in one place. I like to call this a little bit of an ad hoc user access review because this information is synced all the time through our connected systems. So it's at least once a day that you could sync this or really set it up to however often you want it to sync, but it allows you to understand what do they have access to. So now I don't have to wait for that quarterly or annually or every 6-month user access reviews to understand my risk. I can look at her right then and there, or any user right then and there, to understand what my risk profile looks like. I can also see the workflows to see any particular workflow that had touched that user. So that's one way that you can look at risks. The other way that you can look at risk is either through the risk dashboard to understand what risks are happening in your system right now. You can filter that by the individual systems that you're looking for. You can also filter that by time. How do my risks look over the last week versus the last month? Have I improved? Have I narrowed down the risks that are happening within my organization as a whole? So it really allows you to do lots of different things like that. So when we look at, the PLC system in general, it's all about understanding and mitigating the risks that you have within your system. When we look a little bit more specifically for some of the controls within the PeopleSoft system, I'm going to go ahead and sign in single sign-on mode to a PeopleSoft system here real quickly. So I'm just stepping through this process. We can do SP or IP initiated single sign-on, tying into any SAML identity provider. So I'm going to go ahead and launch into PeopleSoft. When I do that, you're going to see a couple of different things. Here's the data masking that we've talked about. This is very targeted and specific data masking, no modification to the page or anything to make this occur. It's all occurring at the platform layer, so you don't have to worry about any sort of compare reports or PUM updates, any of those types of things. You can have a static mask, you can have our click to view. The click to view allows you to toggle the information on and off. The nice part about this too is you can do this by how the person is accessing the system. If they're on your network or off your network, maybe different masks. If I've got a self-service user coming in from home, I don't need them to see their social security number. They should know it. They shouldn't have to come to HCM to understand it and see it. They should have their social security card at home, so that way that data is not exposed. Minimizing your risk, protect the data that's there. It's that layered protection of not only the employee, but also their data sets and things like that. We get into certain transactional protections. This is probably one of the largest transactions that has been dealt with either pulled out or put out on the internet and then taken back in, of direct deposit. How often does somebody change their direct deposit information? Probably not that much, but you want to minimize the risk. So at this point, we're going to invoke a multi-factor authentication very targeted to the process flow for them to be able to even see that data at the same time of accessing the system. Open up my phone here real quick and approve that. Yes, it's me. And now I have access to the data. I can update it. I can change it. Very targeted control. If they don't have access to the MFA device, great, but really maybe they were only coming in to see how much was in each account. So at that particular point, they weren't going to change the account number anyway. So very targeted controls with single sign-on, data masking, protecting what they're looking at, enforcing the least privileged within the application set itself, and being able to report on that. Another area that we see, especially around single sign-on, that causes a lot of heartburn, to put it simply, is the fact that you have very high privileged accounts, whether it's a PeopleSoft administrator, a DBA, some sort of testing. It may end up to where you log into a QA system and you change the password of a user behind the scenes, and then you log in two-tier mode. Not good from an audit flow, not good from data protection. So what we have is our privileged access to where we can switch the identity. The nice part about this is you can select the reason, and then you can select the account that you're moving in and out of. Depending upon how far you want to take this, you can even embed that with certain multi-factor rules, depending upon what MFA you're working with. So I picked the most powerful account in the PeopleSoft system to switch into. Okay, well, I have to perform an MFA challenge to be able even to log into that. So I pass that. Now that I'm in this particular mode, you will see the tile knows I'm acting as PS. I originated this as Vicky Zinn. This is a key thing to many audits that you have to deal with, to be able to understand how really high privileged users are accessing the system and what they're looking at. So now we're going to create a log moving forward that says this is Vicky Zinn acting as PS and touched all of these different pages and all that type of stuff. So it really closes that loop on understanding who is accessing the data, who is looking at it, and really protecting and answering that question from an audit response. I had to deal with that one for years and years and years, so I know people get dinged on that all the time. And it really closes that loop also, because those high privileged accounts that directly log in with a two-tier user account that don't go through MFA, here's your solution to that. Here's your solution to auditing it, and it closes that loop. So between the PLC solution and our attribute-based access controls that we can put into the application, we have the way to layer in that risk removal for you. So I'm going to switch back over to the PowerPoint here real quick. And, as we can see, the solution is really designed for value. It's a turnkey solution that's going to quickly and efficiently allow you to put multiple controls to layer your security and enforce at least risk as possible for your organization. So it's efficient. You can see the provisioning. We can handle the user life cycle management of being able to create, change security, and then also do the lever process. Going back to the lever process, you flip it back to that base security, they're not going to be able to do anything besides what you give them access to very, very quickly. You can prevent and control SOD and fraud protection. You can build in your SOD rule sets. And then you blend that in, because that's really the basis of the compliant provisioning and how you're going to integrate that with your application and the security and access management, because you want to understand, if I give somebody this additional role, what are the risks that I am giving them? And that's why it's important to adopt that proactive, context-aware security to know, hey, if I grant that role, this is now the increased risk that I have as an organization. And it's also going to simplify your access reviews and other controls, as you can see. So we can do things like UARs and gain visibility and understand what that user is touching and seeing inside of the application. So we've got 90 plus different connectors to centralize identity and access governance, so we can communicate to lots of different ERP systems. We can communicate to lots of different access, whether it's Active Directory, seems to be a common one. There's other different identity providers out there, like Okta and things like that. But we can connect multiple different ways. It comes up to, we communicate to PeopleSoft. We can also communicate to applications via API, database connections, so we can connect directly to the database, or we also have the ability to take in a flat file. Somebody always asks that, especially with looking at authorizations. What happens if I have an older system? Okay, well, you can do that. Just pull it in with a flat file CSV. We can pull it in and understand what those authorizations are. This is a very unique governance approach that focuses on preventing risk. It layers your protections in place to be able to give you a solution to protect your PeopleSoft system from beginning to end. It allows you to do compliant provisioning, understand the mover process and those additional authorizations, as well as to protect the PeopleSoft system on the back end with those tactical controls that are put into place. So you can read through here, some of the different advantages that we have. We've got that fine-grained access analysis and provisioning. We do deep transaction inspections of what they did do and what they touched inside of it. We integrate directly into the system. Our PathLock cloud system is definitely cloud or on-prem based, but then we also have the solution with our security platform that sits within the PeopleSoft system to really protect it in a very contextual, access-oriented way. And we can allow a centralized policy management. So with that, I'll just talk quickly about a couple of different benefits, and then we'll open it up for questions. I know we're coming up to the top of the hour. So from an IT perspective, what this is going to do is it's really going to ease the workflow and the workload on them, and it's going to increase the efficiency. So it's going to automate the reporting to the business, because one, you can cut down on the amount of changes and how those changes are accessed into the system. One, because of the consistency, the ease of implementation, it reduces the breach. If we go to that joiner mover lever, we can onboard them consistently. We can also offboard them consistently, and we can offboard them quickly based upon the event within your targeted system, whether that's HCM, PeopleSoft, or Workday, or whatever. We can offboard them just as quickly. The business users, they're going to see a reduced workload of team and control testing, because things are going to be consistent. It's also going to speed up the provisioning requests and the UARs. Also, reliable and clear results. We can see the ins and outs every time. And the UIs are really set around those business users. External auditor acceptance, because they're going to have access to the PathLock cloud system to where they can pull their own reports to make it much faster, so you don't have to go in. You're not dealing with Excel files or searching through emails. You can have one consolidated place for all of the reporting, so it reduces the needs on the consultants, and those auditors are going to be able to do their job much quicker. So about a 70% cost reduction there. And then also internal audits, internal controls and audit, we're going to empower them to access the data directly. That's key. And it's on both sides, whether it's internal or external audit, to be able to access that data, because it's going to be accurate, it's going to be reliable, they can see it, they're going to be able to touch it, look at the reports, build reports the way they want to, and touch on it what's important. So it really shifts the focus from a transaction-based to a risk-based by changing what we're looking at. And it's a business UI, it's not technical. So it's about an 80% reduction in risk. So I know we've got a couple of minutes left, so I want to make sure that we hit some time for questions. So Stephanie, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions at this particular point. If you do have anything that we didn't cover, if you want additional information, you can email us at info@pathlog.com as well.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for your presentation. We have a question that came in that says, we have Pathlock and logging right now. Is this presentation specific to 360, which we don't have, or can we still do this with the current setup with Pathlock and logging?
So that's a really good question. So when we talk about our Pathlock cloud system, it is actually external to what we currently do with the application security platform. So those are two different solutions. The logs that are created within the application security platform, you can still leverage today. Some of those logs, I'm going to say, will be and end up inside of PLC in the future, probably near future. I'm going to caveat that. So that is something that we are pushing information into. And it's really specifically around some of the access review. I'll safe harbor that statement, but that's the area of what it is. So when somebody does a user access review, we'll be able to tell you, yes, they actually touched this transaction, or no, they didn't. So if they didn't ever touch it, why do they need access to it, type of scenario. So, but yes, they are two different platforms. The A360, I actually didn't even show you. It allows us to do very detailed analytics based upon that log data. And we create probably 12 to 15 very targeted logs as to what's coming out of your application security platform to be able to respond and provide data in real time or near real time, since it's sent over very quickly, as to what's happening inside of your system to deal with incident response, usage, all of that type of stuff. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yes, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have for right now. But again, if you do have any questions, please reach out to us at info@pathlock.com, and we'd be happy to answer any more of your questions. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you for coming, and thank you, Greg, for presenting, and we'll see you next time.